Hello everyone, and again thank you for your patience and waiting. We are going to go ahead and get started with Mastering MarketSight 7 Tips and Tricks. My name is Ann Schaefer. I am the Senior Customer Success Specialist here at MarketSight, and we are going to cover different tips and tricks, as you might have guessed, that are going to make your workflow in MarketSight a little faster, a little easier, and ultimately more efficient. As always, if you have questions, please feel to type those in to the questions or the communication text box to us. We'll try to address as many questions as we can at the end of this quick session. And if we can't get to a particular question, or if it's very specific to a particular project, we'll be, of course, sure to follow up with you afterwards by email. All right, so let's go ahead and bring up MarketSight here. I am currently logged into the MarketSight application, and one of the first areas that we're going to look at for some tips and tricks and things to make the workflow quicker are going to be located on the variables page. Now, many of you will frequently deal with recommendation variables of this sort or another, whether somebody would approve of something or like something, essentially your Likert scale. In this case, these particular variables are on a 1 to 7 range here, so a 1 to 7 value scale. When I have these variables, it's common for me to want to do something like a top box, where I might take the top 2 of any particular one of these variables. And of course, if I'm going to make a top box for one of these, I likely want to make a top box for all of them. As a result, I'm going to utilize a feature that you may not be aware of after I make my new regrouped variables. Now, the first thing that I will do, of course, is make my new regrouping variable. And I'm going to call this by today's date. And then I'm going to simply search for the original or predecessor variable here by typing in a search term and hitting enter on my keyboard. Once I've brought up the scale that I would like to use, I can simply then click Add Value, and here I will make my top 2 box. I personally will often include a second value for an all other, so I can get my full sample size here. But of course, that is an option. You don't have to do so. My last thing that I'm going to do before I finish this particular variable is make sure that I place it into this category simply so I can find it quickly and easily. All right, so that's step 1. I've made the regrouping variable for the first of my recommendation scales. Now, step 2 is really the tip or the trick here, and it's the reuse functionality. Whenever you're working with regrouping variables, you can reuse those. To do so, you can simply select the checkbox next to that variable, and then you will see the reuse option here in the gray toolbar become active. This allows me to take that regrouping scheme, if you will, those groups that I defined for one variable, and apply it to all other variables in my data set that share the same numeric value scale. Note that it has pulled up my recommendation category here, as well as variables that may not be the same, but do have that 1 to 7 scale. I can, of course, select one at a time, but most likely I'm going to want to use a shift click on my keyboard to select more than one. Note that there is also a Select All checkbox here in the upper left-hand corner. Last but not least, a couple of other things to be aware of on this dialog. The first is that there is a suffix option. This can make it easier to locate variables if you happen to have a lengthy list of variables. So again, I'll do something like today's date. Now when I click out of that, I will see that suffix will be added to these names. The final thing in this dialog to be aware of is that by default, you are going to place variables into the same category as that original regrouping variable that you're reusing. So if you would like to change that, this would be the menu to use. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and MarketSight is going to create all of those regrouping user-defined variables for me. So there we are. Instead of, say, having to make one per each variable by hand, MarketSight has instead made several in one go. So that's reusing regrouped variables. Now, you may be wondering what happens when I'm dealing with something, a little bit different. What if, say, I am dealing with a conditional user-defined variable? Is that something that I can copy or reuse? Well, you're not able to reuse it, but you are able to copy it and then modify the logic. For example, down here, we have a filter variable. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and make a new variable. So let's make a quick conditional that we can create a copy of. So I will call this gender and travel. And I will stick this into my demographics category, again, just to find this very quickly and easily. So the first component for my value is going to be gender. So I'm going to put in that name. I'm then going to search for that. And I'm going to select Add to Definition. Now, if this were my only value, leaving it as gender would be fine. But I am going to make some subsequent modifications, so you most likely are going to choose to have something a little more specific. So in this case, I might call it women who travel, who recommend communique. So that means I do need some extra logic here, so we'll simply continue that process. So I'll search for travel, and then in this case, I want to choose the logic that greater than or equal to, in this case, let's say 13 to 24 times, and then we'll say and add to definition. So far we have our female travelers who travel frequently, and now we simply need to add in whether or not they would recommend one of our companies. So in this case, I do want to say, and this perhaps probably greater than or equal to, but I definitely want to change that, so I'm going to grab this one here. This is going to count then 6 and 7 of my rating scale. And again, I'll choose and add to definition. Now, that's the general conditional logic, as you are no doubt familiar with at this point in time. But let's say, for example, I needed to make copies of that, as mentioned. I need to make a new version of that. In that case, what I can do is literally copy and then modify that logic slightly. So rather than start from scratch, I would simply select that conditional variable, choose copy, and now you'll see that my logic is pre-populated. So I'll call this gender and travel 2. We'll leave it in demographics. The category will be copied as well. And now all I need to do is simply click into the logic to make some changes. So the first thing I'm going to do is adjust my label here. The next thing I'm going to do is edit the individual logic components. Note that if I select the piece of logic within my conditional, the dialog is actually going to select that logic here. That means it's very easy for me to change it by simply replacing selected clause. Now, since that's all I needed to change, I'm good. But of course, if I select any other component within my logic, you'll see that it pulls up that variable again. And similarly, if I choose this one, that variable is selected for me. So this makes it a little easier to get those conditional variables and to copy them and make new versions of them. Simply choose copy and then modify the logic. Of course, when I click OK, that will be added to my categories list. So I will see those two variables right here. All right, so that brings us to our next section, in fact. We've been mentioning putting variables in categories, and you may or may not utilize categories on the variables list page. A category simply allows you to organize your data set, perhaps a little more easily to navigate. If you click on the category drop-down that you see here, for example, I'm able to select from any one of my categories, and in doing so, that then limits the number of variables that I see. So rather than looking at all of the pages of my survey, I can view a select few. This is something that will occur, and we'll see it later on in a couple of other areas within the interface, but generally it's not a requirement. It just makes things a little faster. So you may be wondering then, how do I really take use of this category? To utilize categories, you'll first want to take a look at your uncategorized variables. Now, chances are good, if you haven't done any categorization, of course, that everything should be following under uncategorized. So in order to take this and put this into something more useful, I'm going to go ahead and choose a new category. So I'm going to select my recommendation variable here. This is uncategorized at the moment. Now if I want to put this into a category that I may have previously created or someone else created, I can simply select the Categorize option here in the gray toolbar and then select the category. Now when I do that, this variable will disappear from my uncategorized list. It is possible to categorize multiple variables at once. So if I would like to do that, I just need to make sure that I select all of the variables that I want to add. Note that I did that with a shift click on the keyboard, but control click will also work to select multiple variables. Now at this point, I will go back to that Categorize option, but I'll choose to create a new category instead. And in this case, I'll call it Satisfaction Coded, because this is for one of my variables that I've coded using MarketSight. All of those variables will then disappear from my uncategorized section, and they will now appear under Satisfaction Coded. Now, the categories by default are going to appear in the order in which you create them, and that may be fine, but it may be that maybe you thought of them out of order. If that's the case, that's okay. You can actually manage the categories and rearrange them too. To do that, I'm going to go to the Categorize button again, and this time I'm going to choose Manage Categories. Now, when I'm here on this page, I'll see a list of all the categories that I have available. To rearrange them, I simply need to drag and drop the variables, and that's going to place that in a new location. So simply dragging and dropping will reorder that list. What I see at the top is going to show on that first page of that variables view. Now there are a couple of other additional interesting things here while we're here that I should definitely point out. In this case, I do have a category for multiple response variable predecessors. It may be the case that once you've created a multiple response variable, you no longer want to view each of those original answer options that are part of that overall variable. You may want to, in fact, hide those. To do that, you can do that here on the Variable Categories page. Simply select the category that you would like to hide, go to the Visibility option here in the gray toolbar, and choose Hide. Now, MRV Predecessors is marked as a hidden category. So if I go back to my Variables page, and I take a look at that categorization drop-down again here, I'll see that MRV Predecessors no longer appears. So you can utilize this to hide variables simply by putting them into a category, hiding it, and that removes them entirely from use because you can't see them here, you can't see them in the crosstabs. Essentially, they're really, truly hidden. Of course, there may be occasions where you need those back, so if that's the case, not to fear, you can get them back again. Simply go back to the Manage Categories, and as you might guess, simply select that category, Visibility, and then Unhide. That category is no longer marked as a hidden category, and as a result, back on my Variables page, when I take a look at that category drop-down, I'll see MRV Predecessors has reappeared. All right, so those are our top tips and tricks for the variables section. The first was reusing regrouped user-defined variables. The second is copying conditional variables, and then categorizing variables and the numerous ways that can be used, such as hiding variables altogether with. Now our next section is going to be in the Crosstab, so let's go ahead and head over to that page now. And I will build a new Crosstab. Now this part is likely very familiar to you. For example, simply searching and dragging over variables that you are likely, again, old hat at. However, a couple of things that are of interest here. Let's say, for example, I look in my survey info category. I happen to have a date completed variable. This variable is a date variable, so it is strictly a date. There's no text information in it, just, again, date information. Now, if I bring that over into my columns, by default, it's going to make a continuous numeric variable. However, there's actually something very handy hidden under this Create Value Ranges section. Now, if I click on that, I'm going to have an option to actually create automatic date ranges. So in this case, I'll choose to specify my date range as all. So this is going to use all of the dates that I have. You can choose individual sections or components of that. So for example, one common thing would be including the current and future years. And then I can choose how I see that date range. So in this case, I'm going to split it up into quarters. And I'll click OK. So I now have these quarterly ranges, if you will, these values, already created for me. To move other variables over so I can see that, I'll simply grab a category here, perhaps the recommendation category, since we've been working on that. And again, a shift click also works in this location, so you can utilize that to move multiple variables over at once. And now you can see here that I have my automatic date ranges for that date variable. All right, another interesting thing in the Crosstab editor is that the tables in my Crosstab can be nested. By default, when I drag over multiple variables like this, they turn into separate tables. So we have table 1 and table 2. MarketSight does not stat test across tables, so it's not comparing, males, for example, to quarter 1. It's not comparing males to quarter 2. It's literally just within each table. However, I can nest them simply by clicking and dragging one of these tables here on top of the other. Once I've done that, I get something like this. To unnest a table, I simply click and drag on table 1 here, my nested version, as though I were dragging something away from it. When I release, that's going to split those variables up again. So again, I'm simply going to click and drag, and that's going to place my categories together. All right, now another trick that we have. In order to give you the, I suppose, full view of this, I'm going to do something that may seem a little silly at first. I'm going to add in the gender variable to my filters, and in fact, I'm going to filter out all females. Now, the reason why I'm doing that in particular is because this is going to leave me with a number of blank columns on the side. Once upon a time, and perhaps even now, you might choose to go in individually and deselect those so that they don't show. However, there is a better and easier way to do that, and that's hidden in plain sight right here, Hide Empty Columns. I'm going to simply check on that, and then MarketSight will remove those empty columns for me. This does require that the entire column from top to bottom be empty, and that can be either zeros or dashes for no information. But as long as it's completely empty, as you can see, those columns are no longer there. There is a similar option in the rows to hide empty rows as well. Again, this is much easier than going in and deselecting individual values, and it's also much more flexible because, of course, your data may change. You might do an append, for example. And if that happens, you would certainly want that filter, in this case the hiding, to modify itself if necessary. So definitely use the hide empty columns and hide empty rows when you get a chance. All right, last but not least in the crosstabs, I do want to point out a couple of other things. So in the rows here, if I take a look down towards my options here, I'm going to see that there is in fact a weighting option. So most of you at this point in time are probably weighting at the crosstab level. Seems logical, right? But it is in fact possible in MarketSight to weight on the variable level. To do so, simply select the options next to that particular variable, and as you can see in this dialog, all I need to do is simply check this box and then find my new weight variable. As in other dialogs, I can see that I can apply this setting to other variables within my crosstab as well. So this is definitely good if you need individualized weighting settings. All right, so we've covered a number of things in our crosstab section with tips and tricks there. We've covered automatic date ranges, utilizing a date variable in the columns. We've covered weighting variables individually. We've also covered nesting tables and suppressing empty columns and empty rows. So do keep those tips in mind because they can come in quite handy. Now at this point, let's head on to some of the more visual options. So I'm going to leave this page now and I'm going to head off to one of our charts. So let's see, I believe I do have a chart in here that I would like to use, best wireless provider. Now when I'm looking at this chart, I may of course want to make changes. That happens. Depending on the kind of change that I want to make, I may need to go a little further or perhaps back to the Crosstab. So say, for example, under the Data tab, I'm currently showing column percent. If I wanted to show something other than column counter mean, I would need to go back to my Crosstab to edit that Crosstab to achieve that. Now, of course, to do that, one could go back to the Crosstabs page and look through the list of crosstabs. But what's probably a lot easier is that every chart has a View Crosstab button here. So if you click on View Crosstab, that will literally take you directly back to the crosstab that underlies this particular chart. That then makes it possible for you to do things like add calculations, make edits, and then you can go back to your chart. So do keep that in mind. There's an easy way to get back to your crosstab with any chart. Now, some other things that we'll want to be aware of relate to the dashboard aspect of visualization. And for that, since there are no dashboards in this account, I'm going to pause for just one moment and then bring up my separate account on a different server. So one moment here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and show my screen again. So that should now be updated. I'm on a different server. And the reason why I've switched to this server is because I want to show you some of the different options about dashboards, and I happen to have some pre-built to speed things up just a tad. So in terms of dashboards, one of the new functions and features in our last release was the ability to utilize the new filter panel. So with the new filter panel, what that essentially does is allows me a greater degree of interactivity. For example, I have date selectors, but I can also do some new things in terms of selection. I can turn my filter automated, or I can make it manual. So if it's automated, it's going to change my crosstabs and my charts within my dashboard anytime I make a change to a filter. If you have just a few filters, that might be the way to go for convenience. On the other hand, if I do have a lot of changes that I might want to make, I probably want to switch that over to manual because that's going to allow me to make, say, several selections, change something down here, and maybe go ahead and change a date. Then I can click Apply to update. Now, another thing that's potentially interesting with the dashboards is, in fact, one of the newer means of creating them. So dashboards, of course, can be made from scratch if you certainly feel like doing so, but probably easiest to, in fact, begin with a dashboard from a template. You may already be familiar with the templates that MarketSight provides. These are pre-built templates that come in a variety of different color schemes, and in order to use one, I simply select it, and then I simply drag and drop my charts over into that dashboard. So again, I might take Best Wireless Provider and move it here to the far side. However, you can also make your own dashboard template. So here's a dashboard tip. If you happen to come up with a layout that you particularly like. So let's say if I go back and I reload the dashboard that I had made, let's say I particularly liked this layout and I wanted to use it again. If that's the case, I can do that really easily as long as I choose to save as template. If I choose to save as template, it's going to appear on that same page as the rest of the dashboard templates, and I'll be able to use it again and again and again. That can definitely speed up the process of creating multiple dashboards. All right, so those are the tips and tricks for visualization aspects within MarketSight. We've covered viewing the crosstab from a chart. We've covered some of the changes that you can make with the new interactive filter panel, such as the new filter types, date selectors, and the manual and automatic modes. And then we've also covered the concept of dashboard templates, and in fact, making your own template by saving as. All right, so our next section relies upon the options. And if I click on my name here in the upper corner, I'll see that I have an options link in that drop-down. This is often overlooked, but it is very handy, so I recommend checking this out at some point. If you find yourself constantly making the same changes within the MarketSight interface, so say for example under Crosstabs, I find myself constantly changing my confidence level to 90%. I don't have to keep on doing that. The options within MarketSight cover almost every single different checkbox or option selection that you have. So in this case, if I select 90% here, and I choose to save all options, that makes it my new default going forward. Keep in mind that this is my default, so it's my username, just me. I don't have an effect on any other user within the account. But it does make my life significantly easier because I reduce the number of clicks that I need to use. This again does cover all of the different areas, so the variables, for example, the charts, different dashboard options that you might choose, or even data views. All of these different things can be adjusted depending on your personal preference. Last but not least, for those of you who are advanced users and who no longer need the Guided Tours tab in the bottom of the application, do keep in mind that on the General tab, there's a checkbox to show guided tours. You can hide the guided tours simply by making sure that's deselected and saving your options. All right, so that brings us then out of the options to our last section here. We wanted to cover some of the new features, in fact, that you're going to be seeing in the next release that's coming out for our hosted main server actually this weekend, come to think of it. So let's take a quick look at those. I'm actually going to head back to the variables page here for that. So back on my variables page, I am looking specifically for the export button. Now, you may have used this before to export a copy of your data set to SPSS. However, now in the new version of MarketSight that's going to be coming out this weekend, you can actually export a copy of your labeling file. This is huge. Many of you have definitely asked about being able to copy labeling changes that you've made, being able to move those from dataset to dataset. Or perhaps you're appending Excel files, and we've recommended that you use the labeling workbook. In that case, this is great because what it does is it literally will fill out a copy of that dataset labeling workbook for you. Now that's queued up and that's run, so I'm going to go ahead and open that. And once that's completely opened, we're going to see a list of all my variables here in Excel. Perfect. So as you can see here, my variable code is filled out. I no longer have to go find that from, say, my data set or perhaps within MarketSight. I can see that all of my names and my value codes have been entered for me. So if I want to preserve labeling changes that I've made, all I need to do, export a copy of this. If I want to change the labeling from multiple variables at once, all I need to do is say, edit these variables, save it, and I can apply it to an uploaded data set. So this makes it hugely possible to make life a lot easier, especially if you're working with Excel. Now, if you are wondering very quickly how to apply a workbook, that's also easy to do. You would simply go to the Datasets page for that. You'll see that if I right-click on the dataset and choose Properties, I'll have an option here to browse for that workbook file. So this would be how you would apply dataset labeling changes via the workbook to your dataset. Note that the Datasets page is also another location where you can export that workbook. So if I go to the dataset and I right-click, I choose Export, I'll see a labeling file there as well. All right, and there's one last feature that we want to show you. So I'm going to head to the Variables page for that one more time. Now, we often make new user-defined variables, of course. And for example, if I wanted to say group household income up, In the past, I would have gone to select that, and I would have found that if I go to new regrouping variable, well, selecting that was great, but it didn't really seem to do much. I need to find that variable here. That's fine. I mean, it's not impossible, of course, but we've actually come up with an easier way of doing things. So I can still do it the old way, but if I want, I'm going to actually right-click on the household income variable. So I'm kind of right-clicking away from the name, and you'll see here that in the right-click menu, I have a Create UDV option. If I select Regrouping Variable now, I'm going to see a couple of very important things for speed. A, my category is already filled in, and B, that variable that I right-clicked on is already selected as my predecessor variable. So I, in fact, don't have to even search for that variable anymore. It's already there. Of course, that means I can just go on ahead and start selecting the values that I want to include. That makes it so much quicker to create new user-defined variables. And again, that's coming out this weekend with our new release. All right, so we are definitely a little over our estimated time, but let's take a look and see if we have any interesting questions that apply to everyone. So one moment here. Okay, so we do have several about weighting. When working with weighting and specifying weighting for individual variables, you can weight on multiple factors. So if you create a weight variable, perhaps through the weighting dialog in MarketSight, and that uses, say, age and income and gender, that can be applied to an individual variable. However, at this time, you can't apply multiple weights to a single variable. It's one weight. So definitely something to keep in mind there. So we do have some calculation options as well under Crosstabs. This is not specifically tips and tricks, but it is relevant, I think, to making the workflow easier. So if you are looking to change the calculations in your Crosstabs, what you want to look for really are the options link next to your row variables. So underneath my row variables here, I see options, calculations, and then this is where I can select different choices such as row percent as well. There is not currently a cumulative percent option, as we have one question for, but we'll definitely put in a feature request for that and see if our engineers can develop it. All right, so to turn off weight variables, you can turn weight variables on and off. And again, that's pretty simple. Depending on where your weighting is, you will either go to the weighting section here, and if this box is deselected, a weight variable is not in use. Or alternatively, if you've weighted your individual variables, you'll simply go back to that weighting dialog where you'll deselect the checkbox here. So it's simply a matter of deselecting the checkbox. All right, that looks like that's it. So great, thank you everyone for your time and attention today. We do appreciate that. If you have any other questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to us, of course, either myself directly or to customer service at MarketSight.com, and we'll be happy to help. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.